Hello! Here's the third and last part on my work creating a gift for my son for completing his master's and starting a new job in Europe. And here's where we left off in part two. This started with a resin printed hull that I designed primarily based on the plans of the Matthew replica in Bonavista, Newfoundland, with wood mass and more resin fittings, which I also designed and printed. I continued rigging shrouds on the foremast and the mizzen. I also fed the anchor hawsers through and around the capstan. And yes, I tied on ratlins. And to prove that I did indeed tie them, now there was no CA glue used in rigging this model. Full disclosure though, I did use CA to glue down coils of rope I added after the rigging was done. And here's the starboard side done. A little work was needed to straighten out the shrouds and even out the ratlins. I decided to have furled sails on all yards. After a couple of test trials, I decided to cut the silk span to about half the height of the sails at scale to reduce the bulk once furled. I ended up gluing thread along the top edge only and folded the silk span over top. You can just make out some of the holes I poked along the top edge to allow me to thread the sail onto the yard. Using a sharp straight edge, I fan folded the material before attaching to the yards. And then gaskets were tied along the length of the yard to hold the sail furled. And here are the steps I used in the sail rigging process. I was worried that I would not be able to feed the threads through the blocks once the yards were attached to the mast. So I pre-rigged the pendants and lift blocks. I felt I would have an easier time attaching the loose blocks to the cross trees or mast tops. Little did I know. So the starboard side of the main yard went on without a problem of any kind, and I thought I was strolling down Easy Street. But on the port side, things went quite differently. And again, the cloud of blue air filled my workshop.
And now for something completely different.
I decided very early in the process that this model will be displayed in a shadow box and found an 8x10 that would fit the bill. I looked for a photo of Cape Bonavista to use as a background in the box, but unfortunately, the Cape looks very different now than it would have in the 1400s. So I took a stab at painting it. I also decided on mounting the model so it looked like it was in water. And I painted the change in blue, which I intended to represent the change from above and below the waterline. As we'll see, it didn't turn out quite as I had planned. Regardless, I'm okay with this background since it will largely be covered by the model. The 3D printing world is heavily into sharing, and rather than drawing up my own waves, I checked out some available online designs and found this base created for tabletop sea battles with 1/200th, 1200th, or 1/2400th models. I used Fusion 360 software to scale it to size, and then I used the electronic hull to cut out the shape I needed to fit the model. The water needed to be a little bit bigger than my printer can handle easily, so I decided to cut it in half and print it in two pieces. And here was one of my first test prints, dry fitted to a prototype hull. Here's a dry fit with the water printed in clear resin. And here's where I discovered that I had made a considerable mistake in measuring. The demarcation line from above and below the waves in my painting did not line up with where the model would need to rest. Furthermore, the topmast, as I had made it, was too long, and later I had to chop almost 1 centimeter off. I wanted to model the bottom of the ocean. At the end of our drive is a small section of gravel, and I scooped up a handful. So this model will take a piece of our home with it. I washed the gravel very well with water, and I accidentally discovered a trick when I poured out the gravel to dry. The larger pieces fell out first, followed by the smaller pieces. This gradient reminded me of an optical illusion I saw when walking at low tide at Bay of Fundy. The rocks got bigger as we walked out, so it appeared as if the water was closer than it really was. And when we looked back at the shore, it looked unnervingly far away. So I tried to apply this forced perspective to the narrow strip on the bottom of the shadow box to try and create an illusion of a longer distance. I had always envisioned at least one anchor on the bottom, and I realized that I had to make a provision for this before adding the model to the box. I glued together the two pieces of these tiny anchors and painted them. And after rigging the hawser lines, I then drilled a small hole in the water and threaded the anchor line through this hole. Small acrylic dowels were epoxied to the sides of the shadow box to act as ledges for the fake water.
And now back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Back to rigging. Once I did get all the rigging installed on a yard, there was a really gratifying moment when I actually used the blocks to tighten up the lines. So the pattern of some good, some bad, some ugly continued until I finished rigging the yards. Some more details. The two-part rudder was glued together and a hole drilled for the rudder pendant. A small figure, which was actually modeled on my son, was printed and glued in the crow's nest. The anchor was rigged in the stowed position. After the rudder was installed, the flags of Canada and Manitoba were added, and then small signal flags were strung to represent my son's cultural heritage: Icelandic, Scottish Métis, and Croatian. Actually mounting the ship in the shadow box took a couple of stages. First, I used UV resin to tack the model to the water line in a couple of places to make sure it was vertical and fit correctly in the diorama. Back onto the bench, I went to fill the gap in the water on the port side with UV resin, thus fully securing the model. Here the model is back in the box where the epoxy was used to glue the water to the acrylic edges that I had installed earlier. I also added more UV resin to fill the gap in the water on the back or starboard side at this time. No! No! When I removed the clamps after the epoxy cured, I discovered that the model had slipped over and was now sticking into the slot that the back of the shadow box needed to fit in. This required a bit of sawing with an X-Acto knife to rectify. And I discovered that some UV resin had plugged up the hole that I drilled earlier for the anchor hawser. This was easily fixed after some obligatory cursing. I printed a label with an inscription and glued it to the back of the shadow box. And here it is, the completed model. It was presented to my son at a farewell luncheon we held for family and the closest friends. So, in summary, her electronic keel was laid on March 25th, 2025. She was completed on January 4th, 2026. And she was commissioned into service on January 11th, 2026. I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed following my journey.